Destroy the child. Corrupt them all.
Today is March 6th, 2014, and today we're joined on the line once again from, well, my backyard here in Japan. We're talking to Ryan Dawson of the Anti-Neocon Report at ancreport.com?
Yes,
Yes,
that's right.
yeah, I always forget that. Sorry. Okay, ancreport.com. I hope people are checking that out. Always some very interesting interviews. And of course, we talked recently about the separation of business and state, Ryan Dawson's new ebook that is available for purchase there. And once again, I hope you'll check out that interview if you haven't done so yet, because I think it was a very important conversation. Today, we're going to talk about something that conceivably, at least at this moment in time, is even more important, or at least as important. And that is what is happening right now in Ukraine, and then more generally with the propaganda war that's being waged right now in quite spectacular fashion, with journalists quitting on air, etc., and all of this interesting zaniness surrounding the topic. So, Ryan, there's a million different ways we can approach this topic, but I think perhaps maybe rather than going in with what's happening right at this moment in the developing story, let's, in our correspondence before this, you were talking about how you think that basically no one's putting in the proper perspective of this story and where it's really coming from. So what do you think is missing in the coverage you've seen of the Ukraine story so far?
Well, I think it relates to the conversation we had when we talked about the book Business and State, and we were talking about how people get into sort of teams with left versus right or Russia versus the West, and people sort of pick a team and blindly rationalize everything from their position but demonize everybody on the other position. And I've seen it very polarized on most of the propaganda networks. And I've also seen just a embarrassing gap in history, just a level of ignorance about Crimea and about the Ukraine and a lot of the atrocities in history. It's sort of disaster porn. It sort of reminds me of the disingenuous care people pretended to have for the Kurds in Iraq when they said the reason for going to Iraq was to liberate the Kurds. And I'm thinking, well, where were you in 97 when they were being ethnically cleansed in Turkey and Iraq, or the Free Tibet movement when that, not to say that's not a problem, but why did you start to care only in 2008 for a couple weeks and then it went away? And so what I see happening is everybody is claiming to care about the people of Ukraine, but that's just cover. It's a do-gooder label to kind of throw up for their other interests, which is just supporting their team, which whether it's the Russians or the EU or the West, which I guess would be the United States mainly. And it's just sort of a label to slap on because it looks better than their real reasons, which are always very Machiavellian and have to do with gas pipelines and military bases, etc. And so that's just sort of sick in my stomach. And I would like to take a moment to talk about Ukraine history and to make these people again, because it's just become a stage, and they have all these disgusting theatrics, these neo-Nazis that are being backed, and the people are just kind of glued to the TV looking at Molotov cocktail explosions and things like it's entertainment. And this is a place, it's really tragic. I mean, this is a place where millions and millions of people, tens of millions of people have died through World War I and World War II. Prior to World War II, we had the Lazar Kavanovich, which was Stalin's Eichmann, go into the Ukraine and implement this program of collective farms, which was an absolute disaster, as collectivism tends to be. But around 10 million people starved to death, and plenty of people were shot as well, and hundreds of thousands were deported to Siberia. And I want to point this out to show that I'm well aware of the crimes the Soviet Union and the Russians did in the past to the Ukraine and many other people. But that doesn't mean you can paint Putin in today's branch as Stalin. That would be an exaggeration. As would to call the Germans Nazis today. I mean, that would be ridiculous. However, you also can't excuse everything that Putin has done either. And that's what I see happening is just a silly, crass generalization where people pick a side. And I don't know why people do that, but that's what I see happening.
Well, I'm so glad that you brought that up, and we didn't really coordinate before this interview, but this is exactly along the lines that I'm thinking, because this is again what I'm seeing is this polarization of the debate, so that people can only admit information that goes with their sort of reading of it, and I think that's just way too simplistic and it excludes way too much of the story. And you talk about some of that excluded history of what's happened to the Ukrainian people in the past and the incredible horrors that they've suffered in the past. And then, of course, even in the recent past, over the past decade, we've seen really the collapse of the Ukrainian economy in many ways and crushing poverty that's been going on there. So these are people with real grievances, and they are real people who are really suffering. And I think that needs to be kept in mind more so than whatever political points can be scored by highlighting this or that particular aspect of what's going on. But I think another, well, I mean, I'll let you talk about any other parts of this, the historical perspective you want, but I think another important part of this is to understand that the Ukrainian nation that we understand today, of course, is a construct that has been in flux for some time, and of course, it was only in 1954 that Crimea was actually transferred to Ukraine when that was still under Soviet control. So it seemed like not a particularly important thing at the time, but of course became important after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that's another excluded part of this history that
well,
plays into what's happening.
Khrushchev was from the Ukraine, or he lived on the border town, and yeah, it's confusing. The Ukraine. It's one of those countries, like a lot of African nations and former European nations, where the borders were just sort of drawn based on the interest of the people who drew the borders, and not really on the differences and the autonomy of the people who actually live there. I mean, the majority of the people in the Ukraine speak Russian. The second largest language is English. Third's the Ukrainian native language, and the reason for that is a really sad history, and it has to do with the famines and things in the 30s. They had the Holodomor is what they call it. It was this great famine in Ukraine and Crimea, where just millions of people were starving to death. There was rampant cannibalization, was a widespread event where people were eating other people and eating the dead. That is how bad it was in Ukraine under Stalin. And this is before anyone knew who Hitler was. This was in the 30s. And then that was the U.S. and the U.K.'s ally later. So that whole narrative of World War II itself of good guy versus bad guy is silly also. I mean, that's just not how things work. But the people in Ukraine really do deserve our sympathy and really do deserve our attention. But I don't think that's what's going on at all here. It's just people scoring political points, like you said, Nazi fascists being promoted on one side, and then the Russians really don't care about Ukraine either. They just care about their own naval base and their gas lines. I mean, that's important to them strategically, and that is a legitimate interest for them. But it has nothing to do with them supporting the autonomy or rights or the will of the people in Crimea or Ukraine. That doesn't matter to them.
No, of course it never does. And I think let's concentrate then on what this conflict is really about, because I think people understand that the protection of the naval base is obviously important, and access to that is important from the Russian perspective. But you mentioned, of course, the gas pipelines, another extremely important part of this puzzle. Let's talk a little bit about how that factors into this.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have a couple things. You have a financial crisis going on at the same time as a political crisis. And then I guess you could call it an energy crisis. I mean, it kind of bleeds into both of the financial and political aspects of it when you start talking about pipelines. And people have to understand how pipelines work. Until they hit a port, they can't really be sold on the open market. They can only be sold to wherever the pipeline physically passes through. And Ukraine geographically has been important because Gazprom's lines, until the South line is built, will be finished next year. A lot of the natural gas that's coming from Russia going to Europe passes through Ukraine. And in Crimea, the way they pay for the bases, this actually relates to the gas because Ukraine has a massive debt to everyone, basically. But Russia would write off $90 million worth of debt every year to Kiev so that they could have water rights through the Black Sea and keep their base there. But the reason they are in debt is mainly because of buying so much gas with money they didn't actually have, and they've been victims of predatory loans like a lot of Latin America has. And this is because a lot of their weak leaders in the past, and not just Yanukovych, but all of them really, since the 50s, have been just salesmen, and they sell out the nation. It's the nation that has the debt, but they personally profit. And it's just, the regular gambit that you see of people selling away the resources and wealth of their nation for personal gain. And the EU has loaned 15-16 billion dollars. Italy has by itself has loaned $6 billion, which they're never going to get back. And this is why the EU is playing soft. They don't want chaos in Ukraine, not because they care about the people, but if that happens, they're never going to get their money for their loans. And they don't want the Russians to come in and offer the same amount with a slightly lower interest rate or something. So it's just a bunch of banksters playing off. And you can see the old yats that Victoria Nuland, who's the wife of Robert Kagan, by the way. You want to talk about a liar anyway, that he was a salesman for the Iraq War, and he and William Crystal, of course, were partners with the Weekly Standard and PNAC and so on. And your audience knows that story, but I'm just pointing out the connections there and how they don't even try to lie anymore, really. But she's part of the FUEU crowd and talking about a coup, and then there is one. And I mean, the press has just been ridiculous on this whole thing. But Gazprom, Gazprom is the name of Russia's large exporter of natural gas and oil. I guess I should have started with that. But they're building 2 lines directly to Germany, and the North line is already finished as of last year, and there will be another one next year, supposedly. So they would be able to bypass Ukraine entirely here in the future. But as it is now, it is an important partner. But the debt, they don't want them to pay the debt. They want them to be perpetually in debt and paying the principal and paying the interest on it over and over again. That's the whole point of driving a nation into debt. But the problem is Ukraine has done that in different directions to the EU and to Russia. And so they're caught really in this tug of war between these enormous powers, and the poor people of the Ukraine have no say in the matter whatsoever. And Crimea is an autonomous region. They have their own parliament. They have their own prime minister, and both he and the president of Ukraine actually called Putin and asked them for military support in the region. So the bit about, well, they broke the Budapest Memorandum, well, that was in 94. The treaty was in 97 and supersedes that. So technically, and I'm not a fan of Putin or anything, but what he did was not illegal, and it's not an invasion. They weren't firing bullets. They haven't killed anyone. That's a dirty label for what happened.
Exactly right. Why do you think this has come to a head at this particular point? Was this something that was part of the plan per se, or do you think that this is just a consequence of the economic situation that Ukraine found itself in?
I think it's a combination. See, there's different interests. The EU wants its money back, but the U.S. interest, what did they gain? They don't gain anything other than Russia's loss. And if you really look at it, they failed in Syria, but if they could have drop the base in Crimea, then the fleets would be stuck and they wouldn't be able to reach their bases in Syria either, the Russians I'm talking about. And so you can see that geopolitical angle to it. But it's really ridiculous. I don't know who's making the foreign policy in the U.S. or what they're thinking, but this is going to be a disaster. But that's pretty common, actually. It's almost like they want to restart the Cold War. They screwed up everywhere else. Let's bring that one back and flog that demon. It really doesn't make any sense because they're not gonna. This is not gonna come out well. I mean, it looks like they're gonna have a referendum on the 16th, which was supposed to be in May, and they've already raced that up to 10 days from now, where Crimea is definitely going to vote in favor for Russia, and then maybe break away like we saw in Georgia in 2008. We could see a section of Ukraine breaking off. And it's sadly, I mean, I'd like for them to have independence for all, but I think that might be the most realistic, least bloody answer.
Well, that's right, and I think that's also another part of the insane hyperbole and hypocrisy that's being floated around right now. Is that people are trying to liken this to? I mean, of course, Kerry came out with that ludicrous statement that you can't invade foreign countries without a proper pretext or whatever he said. That was just
it was so
ridiculous.
19th century to do that,
Yes,
and
yes.
he voted for the war in Iraq.
Exactly, exactly. And I saw an excellent comment recently online. Someone said, "Would you rather live in Crimea right now or in Iraq in March 2003?" Again, it speaks for itself, the hypocrisy that's going on here in the double standard, which is what really gets in my craw. But I think there's a bigger issue here, and that issue is that if it is, I mean, it's obvious that there's so much propaganda being thrown around right now in order to demonize Russia on the geopolitical stage and make it look like it's, the new Hitler, as Clinton actually said today.
Oh, they always have a new Hitler.
Exactly.
But you can see this propaganda months ago. Oh, they hate gays. Like there aren't any other nations that have problems with homosexuality,
well, there was
including
also a report
some of
that
their
came
own
out,
states.
Right. There was also a report that came out recently that deconstructed that and showed, and this was by a gay rights activist who showed that, in fact, a lot of that propaganda was based on people who had never read the legislation in question, and when you actually read it, it doesn't contain a lot of the things that's being said about that legislation. So, I mean, I'm certainly not painting Russia as some, wonderful country, but I don't think I think a lot of the demonization we can see taking place.
No, but it was just grabbing at straws, because simultaneously when they were covering that, the state of Kansas, and I think it was Arizona, I hope I didn't get that wrong, but I know in Kansas they were passing laws they painted it with religion or something, but it was basically saying businesses can refuse homosexuals to serve them. They can't go in a hotel, they can't go in a restaurant, as long as it generally offends somebody's religious rights. And it failed. But I mean, it passed one house, and these are happening in the United States' own states, and that didn't get a lot of coverage compared to how homosexuals might be being treated in Russia. So I found that to be pretty odd.
Right, and we can look at all sorts of other examples, the Pussy Riot idea, and all sorts of demonization that's been going on. And we know that the State Department has been in coordination with the protest groups there, that there is foreign money and intervention that's going into the opposition movement in Russia right now in order to depose Putin. We know that Putin is being targeted by these groups that, again, we are not friends to. So it becomes an enemy of my enemy situation. And in that language, we're supposed to think of Putin then as our friend. That's the position that we're being backed into through that logic. But that is not my position. I do not think of Putin as a wonderful man, and there are a lot of skeletons in his closet. And that's the part of it that I think it's one layer more subtle than what we're being portrayed, because you either have the official story, which is a load of lies and hyperbole and propaganda, or you have the alternative story, which seems to paint Putin and Russia as the heroes in all of this. And I think that too is fundamentally flawed. So let's step back for a moment and talk a little bit about Putin. I've never talked to you about your views on Putin or what he's done or who he is. Let's talk a little bit about his background and where he's coming from and what he's done to Russia.
Well, I'm sure he started in the KGB, which is the equivalent of the CIA. And if there's any parallel of how evil an institution can be, that's what intelligence agencies do. And he worked under Yeltsin, which is weird because later Putin turns on the oligarchs, which absolutely destroyed Russia. So I can understand why a lot of Russians like him, because compared to those guys, 1.7 million Russians starved to death during the collapse of the Soviet Union. And these guys, the late Borzovsky and Abramovich and all these people, Khodorkovsky, etc., they just had this awful voucher scam where they ran away with all the former communist industries that were supposed to be privatized, rather than going to venture capitalists and having some sort of bidding process and some transition for steel, oil, nickel, these mineral rights. It all ended up with these oligarchs under these really bogus kangaroo court type auctions where one of them bet only $1,000 more than the other guy, and they just stole the assets basically for free. And that would take a long time to explain about Sibnev and all that. But here comes this guy Putin, and he's a nationalist. Like he's a gangster, but he does love Russia. He does want, I don't know how to say it. He's kind of like George Bush's father. No one likes Bush Senior. He's much better than Junior, though. And what Putin did with Yeltsin is he buddied up to him, and Yeltsin was a drunk, and he let the oligarchs do everything. And Yegor Gaider, who was the prime minister, he was really running the show for a while. And Yeltsin was in the hospital for a year, for example, in and out of the hospital. He had no control over what was going on. But Putin convinced him, like, hey, let me take care of this Chechnya situation, and he went around he carried a big Bowie knife and stuff, and he knew exactly what to do propaganda-wise to get people in his favor. But when he finally got in power, he turned on the oligarchs, most of them. And he threw Khodorkovsky in jail. Most of the rest of them were exiled. And so you saw this sort of internal war, and he gained a lot of favor. And, compared to the oligarchs, yeah, Putin is like an angel compared to those guys. Those guys didn't care about the Russians at all. They stole all their wealth, and they let people starve to death. So Putin would never go to that level. But outside of Russia, he could give a damn. And that's what people don't understand. I mean, he's a nationalist. He's going to do whatever he can for what he considers his people, but he doesn't care about the former Soviet states or anything. He doesn't give a damn about any of them. And people getting suckered into this kind of idea of being anti-American because America is also an empire and invades nations based on false pretexts. And they're in Yemen now, 4 people dead, 53 in Iraq today, which was a result of the war in Iraq, and of course Syria, etc. And so people sort of hold up Russia and China as these bastions of greatness and saying, well, they're opposed to the American empire. Well, they are, but they'd be doing the same thing and do the same things when they can. And Putin is every bit part of that. But he's a little bit more articulate and clever than our guys.
Well, exactly right. I mean, clearly Putin outmaneuvered the Americans in Syria last year, and quite brilliantly so, and made a mockery of them and served them their own dinner. So that was,
but only because it overlapped with Russian interests.
Exactly
and nothing to do with morality or anything.
Yeah. Exactly. I don't. It's just the height of naivety to believe that this is because of some sort of altruism or wonderful loving of the people on his part. But let's talk about some of those skeletons in the past, and there are many different ones, and I'm not sure which ones you're most researched in, but we could talk about the Russian apartment bombings that brought him into power, more or less. We have the Anna Politkovskaya murder and the murder of 29 journalists during his reign. We have
I think that was on his birthday when he did that as well.
Oh, really? I didn't know that was the calling card. Yeah, that sounds about right. Any other? I mean, what aspects of his presidency do you find the most disturbing in terms of his rise to power and the way that he clings onto it?
Well, I mean, he has open alliance with mafia figures. I mean, people maybe, I don't know how well known it is, but the mob wars in Russia trump any mob wars anywhere else. We're talking about in like 92, 93, that era. And Kaczynski and these guys, Putin has open alliances with organized crime, but he kind of had to get enough power to take on the oligarchs. He did whatever he could to do that, but to get that position, he really had to sell his soul to the devil. And they just straight up murder people, KGB style, bomb journalists, oppressing newspapers, etc. But the thing is, compared to Russia prior to that, considering how bad the Soviet Union had been and the communists had been, like, this level of oppression and killing was minor compared to Russia's recent history. And so people sort of overlook all those crimes in the past. But there's the Litvinenko affair, which I personally don't think the KGB had him killed, because the guy died of polonium poison, and it would be absolutely ridiculous to go kill somebody with an $11 million radioactive element in the UK when you could just stab him in the head. It seems like that was just a botched smuggling operation. And, of course, that guy was working for Boris Berezovsky, who was Putin's main enemy. And so that you had a trumped-up story. So it gets dirty, because a lot of the things they say he's guilty of, he wasn't. But then, like what you're talking about when they killed Anna, that is a famous story in the apartment bombings or the theater gas scenes and things. But it's just one among many, and it happened to get attention. But you'd have to really dig into it. There's a good book called The Godfather of the Kremlin I recommend people read. was the Russian editor for Forbes magazine, and he was actually killed after the book was published. He was shot, and then he was in an elevator in a hospital, which got stuck conveniently, and unfortunately he passed away. But I mean, that really goes over a lot of the Russian politics, and it's just nasty. I mean, there's not a quick way to sum it up, but Putin is not a clean cut guy by any means, and he really, I compare him to Bush's father, who was also a director of the CIA and involved in a lot of killings himself, more than just when he was president or vice president.
Exactly right. Yeah, that brings up a lot of different points, and yeah. Who else was killed with polonium?
Well, Arafat, probably.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Well, I think that's
Russia.
where they got it from, because if you look at the planes that Litvinenko were riding back and forth to, it was to Israel, and they had traces of polonium all over it, as well as Boris Bosky's residence. So it's pretty clear to me they were smuggling that stuff in from Israel. But what were they going to do with it? They couldn't carry it out afterward when he botched it and died of an overdose. But what were they going to use that for? A dirty bomb, or what was the point? That was the question mark that I had there. But
there's a huge story there, and if you don't value your life very much, I suppose you could really dig into it.
Well, that's why I dropped it, actually.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's. I mean, that's the type of story that genuinely is the kind of story that can get you killed. So there's, I mean, just so many of these types of things floating around there. The Polish presidential plane crash.
Well, yeah, that, and what was, prior to that, when Saakashvili and the Polish president did their stunt in Georgia, which was ridiculous as well. But then I think that may have been possible motivation for that. But I don't know. I don't have enough evidence on that one. Like, I don't disbelieve it or anything, but I didn't really dig into that. I just assumed, like, oh, that's probably true, but
the more I looked into it, the more suspicious it became. And there's a lot of good info out there, but unfortunately a lot of it is in Polish, so it requires a bit of digging.
Well, I believe you, but it's not something I personally dug into. So,
all right. Well, I guess just the point that I'm trying to get at here is that there are an awful lot of skeletons in this closet, and it just seems to me that a lot of people are being pushed into that dichotomy that you were talking about. That the Chinese and Russians are standing up, therefore they're the good ones. And I guess my point is that this needs to be confronted, and it needs to be confronted now, because we really are being pushed into, at the very least, whatever they're calling it, the new Cold War, or whatever they're trying to call it at the moment, and the battle lines are being drawn right now, and we collectively, the human species, is being asked to take sides in this, as if there is a side to take which is not bloody and disgusting, and one that I don't want to take. And I think it's important that we consciously make the decision not to put our lot in with one of these bloody, brutality-driven regimes, just because, well, you've got to be for something. You've got to be for one of these sides.
Yeah, I don't want to sound alarmist or anything, but this is sort of how World War I got going. I mean,
exactly right. And here we are 100 years later, and we've seen this sort of shades of World War I starting to reappear. And what does this mean? Where does this put us? How did we get suckered collectively into World War I in the first place? It's because people walked into it. And maybe there 100 years ago they had the excuse that they hadn't seen anything like that before, but we've seen it. We've lived through this collectively for generations now. We've seen this happening over and over again, and I think there's got to be a way for us to make that mental decision not to put our lot in with one of these two sides before it becomes too late. On that note, are there anything that you would like to suggest to the audience, or any sources that you think are important in regards to keeping ourselves above this fray?
I think for your audience, since it's an intelligent audience, something they ought to do is go back and look at why Ukraine is in the financial condition that it's in to begin with, because the political crisis was predicated on the financial crisis. And so you're going to have to see, well, why did they accept so many loans, and who did it, and what was it for, and where did the money go? Because right now, they won't be able to pay their bills for another 2 weeks. They don't have any money. I mean, they can get a second loan to pay for the first loan, a third loan to pay for, like, that sort of system. But you have to understand the financial problems first, and then resources, and just ignore what's on television, that theatrical stuff. I mean, there was a good article in Politico, believe it or not, called Disaster Porn that I recommend people read. It was by Sarah or Susan Ken just look up disaster porn Politico, and you can find that. But I mean, I don't know. I can tell you sources that I read, but I don't really have like fixed sources. I just sort of read around, and I use my head and say, well, does that make sense or not with everything else I know? And there aren't really any sources that are always accurate. I mean, it's sort of hit or miss. So I don't really have a formula. But
well, no, I think that is the answer that we have to use. Use your head. And unfortunately, there's just no shortcut to that. And it involves a lot of digging. And one of the points that I would put on the table there is to take a look at who is now assuming power in the newly formed Ukrainian government. And you look at figures like Ihor Kolomoisky, who I'm probably mispronouncing there, who's just become the newly minted governor of Petrovsk, which I'm definitely mispronouncing, but it's the industrial.
Oh, he's a Stefan Bandera. Just he thinks he's an absolute hero, and this guy was I guess you could say the Nazi in charge in the Ukraine. He was Ukrainian, but yeah, and they just heroicize him. And it's again just what we were talking about. Yeah, the Russians killed millions of people in Ukraine, so a lot of them jumped on the German side as liberators, but Hitler he didn't give a damn about Ukrainians. He actually suggested privately that, assuming he was going to win, that when they opened up the schools there, they were only going to educate them enough to read the road signs in the minimal level and drown them in academic minutia, but make sure that they're never going to threaten German engineers or anybody. I mean, they're so Machiavellian and disgustingly evil, and people get suckered for it. Oh, that team hurt me, so I'm going to jump on this other psychopath side.
It's so true, and again, there are so many different points that we could put into that matrix to show that people are constantly being suckered in again and again, and every time they think they're getting out of it by just joining another group, it turns out that group, of course, is just using their membership as a springboard and a catapult to consolidating their own power. So again, it's oligarchs getting into power who are replacing the old cronies who were in power before. Again, Yanukovych versus Yushchenko. I mean,
yeah.
Again, either side of a feces sandwich is not tasty to me.
Yeah, the old gas princess and everything else.
Exactly.
And yeah, it's just. I mean, I'm glad you see it, but it is frustrating, and I wish I had like a quick formula or answer on how to get people to think more critically and not get stuck in these kind of games. But I mean, if I could answer that, we could change a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, hopefully this conversation goes some way to at least getting people thinking along that path, and that's the first part. Cognitive liberty comes one person at a time, and it comes from people refusing to accept the main narratives that are being propounded, either the mainstream narratives or the alternative narratives. We have to look critically at both sides and come to our own decisions, and perhaps find a third way. Well, okay, I don't think I have any more specific questions on this. Are there any other points you'd like to put on the table before we wrap this up?
Well, I think, we'll see on the 16th what happens in Crimea, and I want to caution people, not to get emotional about this. You don't want to die over Kiev or anything, but just have a cool head and look at this, and people do have a right to self-determination, and if they decide to join with the Russians, they may see that as the lesser of three evils sort of situation. And so have sympathy and look at things critically and just try not to get suckered by propaganda. In fact, you ought to watch TV and then automatically be able to cancel one thing out, whatever they said, because it's not going to be true.
Exactly right. Or just turn the TV off altogether. All right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think this is a productive conversation, at the very least, to get people thinking along these lines and get them out of that duopoly, which is the formula for control and always has been and continues to be a very effective one. But hopefully the irate minority is listening and is out there and is engaged and is not going to fall into that trap. And let's direct people over to your website again so that they can get a handle on your podcasts and the work that I know is coming out on a regular basis there at ANC Report.
Yeah, ancreport.com has the podcast. I've recently been doing a lot of writing, but I'm bringing some new people in. So we'll have myself and some others who will all be doing podcasts there. And I'm getting ready to post a bunch in a row, mainly on Ukraine, also Venezuela, and because that's another topic we could get into too. So yeah, check that out, ancreport.com. That stands for Anti-Neocon Report. Whether it's neoliberal, neoconservative, it doesn't matter. I mean, I'm not fixed on labels. I just picked one, But yeah, I'd appreciate it. Bookmark it. and it's mobile friendly now. So I'm a little slow on the technology side of things.
Yeah, you got to get the RSS working. I would
Yeah.
subscribe to that podcast in a minute, but I can't.
Yeah, I know. I just send links around, but it's all going to be fixed within this month. Just had a lot going on over here in Nara and Osaka, personally, and other things. So,
All right.
But yeah.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time today, and best of luck in the future. Well, let's keep in touch.
Yeah, we should do this more regularly, James. All right. Peace.
Make fun of me all you want. This is their plan, people. They're frickin' interdimensional invaders.